Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay, just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident cultural warrior. I hope you're all doing awesome on this fine and lovely day. All right, yeah, got another doozy for you. You have a good idea of what's coming, because of the thumbnail and the title that I would have given it. But yeah, let's get right into it. This coming to us from the folks over at MovieWeb. Lord of the Rings: Why Changes to Tolkien's Lore Are Necessary for the Rings of Power. This ought to be good, folks. All right, Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power has been criticized for changing the details of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, but change can be necessary. All right, let's see what we got here. So we've got Prime Video's new Lord of the Rings series, The Rings of Power, has been the recipient of a lot of criticism since the first season aired in the second half of 2022. Some of the criticism directed at the series, such as the uneven writing and flat characters, is valid. However, one of the biggest critiques is doesn't quite hold as much water. Okay, I'm sorry. When did the guys that or folks that write for these online is English no longer a requirement? And when I mean like your basic writing and understanding of English. However, one of the biggest critiques is doesn't quite hold as much water. Okay, whatever. We'll go with it. At least not yet. That chief complaint is regarding how the series is adapting the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. The Rings of Power adapts the Second Age of Middle-earth, which is an era of The Lord of the Rings that general audiences are less familiar with. The events of The Rings of Power are set thousands of years prior to The Lord of the Rings, and there are many different characters and parts of the world depicted in the series that no longer exist in the Third Age when the tales of Bilbo and Frodo Baggins unfold. Get out of there. For fans of Tolkien's books, however, the Second Age is a very familiar time. That era of Middle-earth has been explored through numerous texts written by Tolkien. A general outline of events is detailed in the appendices included at the end of the Return of the King novel, while other details are expanded upon in the Silmarillion, entries in the History of Middle-earth series, and other supplementary materials. For ease of those wanting to dip their toes into the lore of the Second Age, most of these writings have recently been compiled into one single book titled The Fall of Numenor, which is a great book, by the way. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of material to get familiar with, and many die-hard Tolkien fans have spent years submerged in the wondrous depths of Tolkien's legendarium. However, The Rings of Power has made some significant changes to the material as it has been brought to the screen. While these changes have upset many fans, some of them are unavoidable. Okay, some things just don't translate well to the screen. Okay, I'm interested to see what they have to say about this. If you're a massive fan of any novel or pre-existing story, it's only natural to want the on-screen adaptation of it to be as faithful as possible. There's something truly special about getting to experience a story you love brought to life in front of your eyes. Seeing something that had previously only existed on the pages and in your imagination be brought to life through film can be a dream come true for fans. However, it's important to keep in mind that there are bound to be changes to the material. Some things just don't translate well when adapted to the screen, and it can be necessary to make changes for the sake of telling a coherent story. There are many aspects of just about every written story that work well on the page but wouldn't be as effective when depicted visually. While there are certainly movie adaptations that have been praised for being both excellent films and faithful adaptations, every story is different and must be approached differently. Okay, I agree with that paragraph, okay, in a general sense, as somebody with a filmmaking background. There are some things that don't translate well. For instance, inner dialogue, right? If the conversation somebody's having with themselves in their head, okay? Very rarely does that translate well on screen, right? Generally, you'll have to do it either through some kind of voiceover or a flashback type of thing or some sort of something like that. It doesn't very translate very well or very easily. So in that regard, I'm with them so far, but let's see where they take it. It's important to keep in mind that just because an adaptation is faithful does not mean that it is good. The opposite is also true. Some of the best book to film or television adaptations have made significant deviations from the source material. Faithfulness to the source material is only one of many aspects that have to be taken into consideration when adapting a story to a new medium. The most applicable comparison to The Rings of Power is the trilogy of films based on The Lord of the Rings that Peter Jackson directed in the early 2000s. Those films are considered to be one of the best trilogies of all time, and they are generally considered to be excellent adaptations of Tolkien's work. However, that doesn't mean that they are completely and utterly faithful to the books. There are many notable differences between the story of The Lord of the Rings as it is told on the page and as it is presented on screen. Numerous key characters and world-building moments are omitted from the films entirely, while other major moments and character personalities are adjusted and rearranged. Even the extended editions of the films, which add a few of these elements back into the story, do not include the likes of Tom Bombadil, Baragond, the Citadel Guard, or the Scouring of the Shire. Okay? There are undoubtedly aspects of the Second Age of Middle-earth that would not work on screen, even with a budget as astronomically high as The Rings of Powers. Aspects of the Númenórean culture, such as the yearly gathering to witness the bears of the island doing a big dance together, would be a bit strange for a show like The Rings of Power. The biggest reason, however, for many of the exclusions from the Second Age as shown in the series is that Amazon only has the rights to the core Lord of the Rings books and the information included in their appendices. That means that the series can only adapt the Second Age as far as it is described in the appendices of The Return of the King. All the other expanded material of the Silmarillion, Fall of Numenor, and the rest of the books is entirely off limits. So, even if they wanted to, the showrunners couldn't inject any dancing bears into the Rings of Power. Okay, and I already have a counter argument for this, but let's hear what they say. Condensing the timeline. However, even though the Rings of Power is limited to the descriptions of the Second Age that are given in the Lord of the Rings books, that still provides the series with plenty of material to pull from. In addition to the numerous conversational explorations of the Second Age within the story itself, the appendices expand and detail many of the key legends and events of that time. Appendix A gives a thorough description of the line of Númenórean kings and the island kingdom they ruled over. Númenor is essentially given a complete history that leads all the way into the establishment of Gondor and Arnor in Middle-earth, the assault upon Mordor at the end of the Second Age, and many of the events that followed for the men of Westeros. Beyond the kingdom of Númenor, the appendices of The Lord of the Rings also detail many of the key moments from the Second Age in Middle-earth. Tolkien described everything ranging from the elven kingdoms of Lindon and Eregion to the realm of Mordor, Sauron's return, the forging of the Rings of Power, and the numerous wars that defined the age. This all gives the Rings of Power a solid roadmap to build upon. However, translating that story to screen isn't as simple as it was adapting The Lord of the Rings for Jackson's films. That's because none of those stories are told from a first-person perspective or in any similar narrative. It's all relayed essentially in the same manner as a historical text. There's no dialogue or elaborate descriptions of smaller details. It's a general outline that recounts the story without delving too deeply into the nitty-gritty of it all. The key exploration of the Second Age that is given in the appendices, however, is a complete timeline of events which is provided in Appendix B, The Tale of Years. This roughly 1.5-page timeline outlines all the major events of the Second Age, with one look at at the timeline, it's clear that change was needed to adapt it into a show or movie. That's because the major events of the time, such as the forging of the rings, the destruction of Numenor, and the march of the last alliance against Sauron, all take place over the course of nearly 3,500 years. In Tolkien's text, the Rings of Power are forged nearly 2,000 years before Isildur's even born. If the Rings of Power were to adapt this story faithfully, it would either become the longest running TV series in history, with major characters like Elendil and Isildur only appearing in the final season, or the pace of the show would be so frantic that nothing would be understandable. In order to make things more digestible for general audiences, the showrunners of The Rings of Power wisely made the decision to condense this timeline down to a much shorter time frame. While there will likely still be significant time jumps between seasons, most of the major events of the Second Age will occur in roughly the same half century, within the lives of men like Isildur. Even though this is a massive change from the way Tolkien established the lore, it was the best decision that could have been made for the show. It allows the depiction of all the key story points while keeping consistent characters that can be followed throughout it all. It may seem blasphemous to a Tolkien purist to depict the Rings of Power being forged in Isildur's lifetime, but to general audiences and from a general story perspective, it was undoubtedly the right call to make such a change. The need to be careful. Now, while major changes like that are essential to making the story of the Second Age more coherent for a visual medium, that does not mean that the Rings of Power gets a free pass to just run wild with the source material. If the series were to really go off the rails and suddenly kill off a character like Isildur, or bring the likes of Bilbo Baggins into the story, there would understandably be a lot of people upset. There is a delicate balance that needs to be struck when it comes to adapting any material. While changes will inevitably have to be made, even if they are dramatic, the adaptation needs to maintain the spirit of the source material. That's a big part of why the changes made for Jackson's The Lord of the Rings are forgivable. The films he produced thoroughly preserved the heart and spirit of what they were adapting. The core plot and emotion of the story were untouched. So far, The Rings of Power hasn't shown that it is taking the same careful approach to the spirit of what it's adapting. There have been a number of other major changes from the source material that alter the actual substance of the story, the biggest of which is the character of Annatar. In the source material, Annatar is a disguised Sauron who lived among the elves for many years and gradually deceived them into creating the Rings of Power. It's one of the core aspects and moments in the entirety of Tolkien's lore, and the Rings of Power seems to have altered it almost beyond recognition. This was done by entirely omitting the character of Annatar, replacing him with Sauron's new guise of Halbrand, who pretends to be a long-lost king of men. Then, in the Season 1 finale, an injured Halbrand is brought to the elves in Eregion for healing, where he swiftly convinces them that they need to forge the rings in order to preserve their long life. While the Rings of Power could double back on Annatar in future seasons, it would risk retreading on a story the show has already told, while also deviating even further. The choice to condense the timeline of the Second Age is understandable, but to blatantly alter the story itself is less so. If the Rings of Power continues to make major changes like that in future seasons, then many of the criticisms lobbed at the series will start to hold much more weight. The show will lose what makes The Lord of the Rings really special, in favor of cheap attempts to surprise fans who are familiar with the material. While it is important to give the creatives behind the show the room they need to tell the story, it is equally important that those creatives tell that story with consistent respect for the material they are pulling from. It's a fine line to walk, but it's one that has been walked before, even within this same franchise. If the Rings of Power is to win back the diehard fans that have been so critical of the series, the showrunners need to stick more closely to what has made the material work in the past, with changes only coming when an opportunity to genuinely expand upon or enhance the material presents itself. All right, and that's Kyle Kruska. I'm going to assume that's how you pronounce the last name, Kruska. All right, let's discuss. Okay. Oh, and I'll give Kyle props. You know, he does sort of swing back around to where I could agree with him again, right? So, yes, as somebody who's done film stuff, visual effects stuff, yes, I do understand that there are certain things do not translate well to the screen, right? You're gonna there's gonna be changes, right? It's a given, right? No matter what the franchise is, there's gonna be changes, right? Um, and Peter Jackson made changes, right? You know, Sam and Frodo in Osgiliath, you know, Arwen taking Frodo to Rivendell as opposed to Glorfindel, um, so on and so forth, right? Tom Bombadil and Goldberry not making the cut. And that's fine, right? And I think what Kyle says, sort of as when he swings back around to it, holds true. If you make changes, but you're sticking to the core elements of what makes the story special, right? Then I think you as a filmmaker and a creative, you have a lot more leeway, right, to make changes. And I think that's one of the things that the Rings of Power, the showrunners, Payne and Decay, and the Amazon crew, that's one of the things they don't understand, right? I think that they assumed that they could just put this out there. Well, we're adapting all this material, you know, so we have to condense things and we have to change certain things, and but the reality is, no, you don't. No, you don't. One of my biggest argument is, you know, you're saying that you're taking 3,500 years worth of history and you're trying to condense it down into 5 seasons. So therefore, by default, you need to condense it all down into, you know, a 50-year time span, let's say, right? And on the face of it, you know, that seems like a legitimate, you know, position to have, I suppose, right? My question to that would be, why the fuck did you think you needed to put every single thing on screen? Like, if you're operating off of the appendices and you have the Tale of Years, why do you feel you need to have the rise and fall of Numenor, as well as the battles of the Last Alliance, as well as, you know, Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, convincing the elves to make the rings and stuff like that? Why not just focus on one aspect, right? Why not tell the story of Numenor? Right? You could have done that. Now, some people would say, well, you know, the Numenorians and their extended lifespan and stuff like that. But if you just told the story of Isildur, right? Or just the story of the fall of Numenor, right? You don't have to tell all of it, right? If you could tell the story of just the fall of Numenor, right, with Ar-Pharazôn, right? Just, you know, sort of do that prologue that Peter Jackson did so well with Cate Blanchett, you know, and they sort of tried to do with Rings of Power, but it came off a little flat. You know, do that sort of prologue that lets you know where Numenor was, how it came to be, and what's gone on, and how it's morphed into where we're at now in its, you know, final days, right? And there's your series. Right? You still get to have that whole Sauron evil influence thing, right? You still get to have the wonder and magic of, you know, the Undying Lands and all that stuff. And you still get to end with the big, catastrophe, right? But you don't have to tell everything. And that's the problem. And that's why I don't buy the excuse of, oh, well, you know, for us to tell everything, you know, that's 3,500 years and we have to try to condense it down, because otherwise, you know, we'd have a show that has 50 seasons, you know what I mean? And, you know, people would grow old, have children, and die before the show was over. But you don't have to tell everything. You're choosing to because you want to milk this for as much money as you can. That's the thing. All right, it's that you spent $1 billion on it. You're trying to milk it for as much member berries as you can. That's what this comes down to. Okay, because that's the other aspect to it. You're making changes to Tolkien's lore that are absolutely unnecessary and unjustifiable. Right? For instance, having what we all can presume to be Gandalf showing up now in the Second Age. Right? Okay, not necessary. You're doing that because you're trying to play into the member berries of Ian McKellen's Gandalf, right? Same thing with the Harfoots, Okay, we all know that the hobbits don't show up anywhere in the history until the Third Age. Yes, you could make the case that, well, they evolved at some point prior to the Third Age, but they don't show up, and they're pretty much they're non-existent in the Legendarium until that point, right? But you're putting them in there because you like, and they've come out and said this because they felt that at Lord of the Rings you need hobbits, so they just felt they needed hobbits, so they needed to change the lore to fit the hobbits in there. Same thing with Sauron and the Halbrand stuff, right? It wasn't necessary, but you need a baddie, right? Got to have the bad guy, right? So a lot of their changes are unnecessary, which fly in direct contrast to everything that Kyle Krusky from MovieWeb just said, right? And that's the problem. Like, Kyle and them are still wanting to give the show the benefit of the doubt as creatives. They're saying, oh well, certain things don't translate well to the screen, and I agree, certain things don't. And they say, well, they gotta, as long as they don't deviate too far from the core and the heart of what the story is about, they should be okay. But the reality is they already have. And that's the problem. That's what has got fans so upset, is that whether you like it or not, they already have. They've thrown the lore completely out the window. I mean, for fuck's sake, Galadriel's supposed to be married with a daughter at this point, okay? And all we got was one throwaway line of, yeah, I had a husband once. He left for war. Never saw him again. Wonder if he'll magically pop up in season 3, right? Okay, which is fine. So what about your daughter? Where's she been? Okay, how are you going to explain that one? Okay, not to mention, even if your husband went off to fight and didn't go, why are you hunting down Sauron who killed your brother? Right, you're willing to kill your fellow elves to hunt down Sauron because he killed your brother. Your husband goes off to war and disappears. You don't even think to go look for him. Like, I mean, this is just like writing 101 level shit that they're fucking up, right? And so I won't make the excuses for it, and I won't accept the excuses for it. And as much as the Kyle Kruskys and MovieWeb of the worlds try to say, oh well, you can't, you got to have a little flexibility when you're adapting these type of things to the screen, because you can't adapt everything. It can't be like a word for word. We get that. Peter Jackson showed you how you could do it, okay? But Pain and Decay have chosen not to do that. Pain and Decay have said, oh, well, this is fantasy and it's Lord of the Rings, so we got to have a wizard, so let's bring Gandalf, even though it totally fucks up the lore. And we got to have hobbits, so let's bring hobbits in it, even though it totally fucks up the lore. And we got to have, Galadriel and Sauron have this maybe almost kind of, I'll call you, send me a text later, maybe message, sort of love interest, little sexual tension between the two, even though it completely fucks up the lore, right? And that's just so that they can milk it for as much money as they can. That's what this comes down to. So Kyle, yes, I agree with you that you can't expect filmmakers to translate a book word for word from the page to the screen, and you have to give them some creative leeway. You also have to hold their feet to the fire when they completely screw the pooch on it, and the Rings of Power has completely screwed the pooch on it. Sorry, I get a little heated about stuff like this because, that's within my sphere of things that I actually know. All right, guys, so let me know what you think down in the comments section below, right? What do you think about this concept of adaptation and, MovieWeb sort of, again, running interference for the Rings of Power, making excuses for their complete lack of understanding of the lore and adhering to it? Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Remember, if you like the video, then like the video. If you feel like sharing the video, by all means do so. It helps with the algorithm. It helps get us seen. It helps people look at us and go, wow, he's taken that whole YouTube channel thing and he's adapted it to the screen so well, right? If you haven't subscribed already, I would hope that you would consider subscribing and joining our army of beautiful badasses, because we're here holding the line and holding the ground for the professor and his works, and we're not giving an inch, right? We're not beholden to Amazon. We don't owe them anything, and the more they keep trying to, send the BS bombs our way, the more we'll just keep knocking them back across the net. Anyway, if you have subscribed, thank you again from the bottom of my heart. It means the world that you've decided to join me on this journey, and we will keep it going. All right. And until then, remember to be good, be safe, be awesome. But most importantly, as the folks from the live stream on Saturday have decided, the most important thing you can possibly do today is to stay more dorkish. Peace.